Hello.
Hi, Ethan. It's Jack Hues here
Jack,
from Wang Chung.
how are you doing, my friend?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic, man. Thank you for taking the time to call in today.
It's a pleasure.
I got to tell you, Abducted by the 80s, the tour that you guys are on right now with Men Without Hats, the Motels, and Naked Eyes is going to be swinging through Florida here in June. Abducted by the 80s was actually the title of a Wang Chung album that came out, what was that, 2010?
Yeah, it was actually, the album was called Taser Up. Came out in 2012, I think. And Abducted by the 80s was a super quirky track on that album.
Well, for those of us that were there in the 80s, many of us kind of felt abducted by it because it was, you know, the 80s still to this day was its own little microcosm of a thing as far as an entire decade of music and fashion and everything, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think when people look back on it now, they see it as a very kind of optimistic time, you know, particularly compared with the current situation, you know. So we're, you know, very proud to have been a part of that.
That's for sure. It was definitely much of a rosier outlook in the 80s than in the last decade, at least, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think he had its problems. You know, I remember when, you know, Reagan got elected president, everyone was like, oh, God, it's the end of the world. But now that seems pretty mild to what you guys are looking at. You know?
Now it seems like no matter who's elected, somebody's going to say it's the end of the world, right?
Exactly.
I gotta say, let's go back. Your real name, Jeremy Ryder. That's a pretty rock star name in its own right. So, what made you do the switch to Jack Hues?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, I guess back in the late 70s when I first met Nick and we were playing in a kind of punk band together, the name Jeremy was always a bit complicated. I guess in the UK, it's got certain sort of middle-class overtones, shall we say, you know. And anyway, I'd written a song called I'm Jack Hues, which was a play on this idea of Jack Hues. It's a French phrase, the title of a couple of different books, actually, but both of them were accusing. I accuse you, it means in French, Jack Hues. They were accusing governments of corruption and stuff, you know. And a friend of mine said, oh, Jack Hues, that would be a funny pseudonym to take on. And I thought, yeah, I'll kind of own that for a while. And it kind of stuck, you know. In the early days of working with Nick, we all had pseudonyms, and most bands, you know, like, you know, Joe Strummer, Sid Vicious, Sting, you name it, you know, we all adopted these kind of pseudonyms for one reason or another. Mine stuck for whatever reason, so I continue to be Jack Hues, and I guess, you know, everybody meets me as Jack, you know, even my wife called me Jack rather than Jeremy. So.
I bet that can get a little confusing every now and then with the wife calling you Jack.
It's quite useful, actually, you know. Having an alter ego facing the world is sometimes easier than doing it yourself, you know. So.
If somebody's upset with you, you can be like, I don't know, no, Jack, my name's Jeremy.
Exactly right. Yes. And I do have both names in my passport, actually, which is interesting. I thought when I renewed my passport the last time that they would be kind of like, no, the computer says no, you can only have one name. But in fact, you know, they still let me have two names. So that's cool.
So you could actually go on the run and hide out for years now, huh?
Absolutely. Yeah, like I say, it's very useful.
You got to give a little bit of credit to Jeremy Clarkson from Top Gear and Grand Tour fame for making Jeremy, I guess, a little bit better of a name in the UK, at least. Yeah, no, I guess, well... Maybe not always.
Posh, isn't he? I mean, let's face it. He's a bit posh. He tries not to be.
Yeah, he's definitely a bit posh, I agree. He's hilarious at times, but he's definitely a little up there.
Yeah.
I interviewed Boy...
outspoken,
yeah, absolutely. Very outspoken. I interviewed Boy George last year, discovered that in the late 70s, you guys in 57 Men, the predecessor to Wang Chung, also part of a large group of musicians that moved around bands and found some level of success, like Lee Gorman, who went on to Bow Wow Wow, who also briefly had Boy George and Adam and the Ants and stuff. So were you aware that there was just something brewing in the scene that you guys were in?
It's interesting. I was talking to someone else about this, you know, how was it being part of this golden age, you know, And when you look back on it, then you can see the connections. When you're actually in it, it's much more difficult to see that. But I think there was a sense, where, especially when we were working with Lee, Glenn Gregory, who went on to be the singer in Heaven 17, was also in 57 Men.
Yeah.
And there was this sort of pool of musicians. There was a scene going on. Do you know what I mean? I think in those days, before mobile phones and the internet and the whole kind of what you might call fake scene of online stuff, you actually physically had to be somewhere, to be part of the scene. And we bumped into all kinds of people all the time, on the touring of different bands as we went up the levels. We toured with the Human League for a while. Someone was asking me about the band Japan, and I remember doing some gigs with them as well in the early days. So and I think we were all sort of unknowns at that point, all trying to find a place on the ladder. I guess I'm just glad that Wang Chung found a niche, very much over here in the States rather than in the UK. That we're still enjoying the fame or the notoriety or whatever it is we've got.
I noticed if you look at almost every decade, being America-centric as I am, never having lived in England or the UK, we've always, every decade has had a very cool British invasion. You had the beginning in the 60s with the Beatles, obviously. The 70s, you had all kinds of bands. 80s, Wang Chung and Berlin and Bow Wow Wow, Boy George. And the 90s with, the Stone Roses and Happy Mondays and all these kinds of things. So there's always been this amazing, and you guys were part of that really cool 80s British invasion in America.
Yeah. I mean, I think because the unusual thing with Wang Chung is that we were signed direct to Geffen Records in Los Angeles. Most British bands, Stone Roses, good example, had their deal in the UK, were successful here first, and then, they sort of were an import into the USA, whereas we were, in a sense, if you were like a journalist and got a review copy of one of our albums, it would come from LA, it would seem like an American band, So we were much more soaked in the culture in some ways, I think, than the other UK bands. But I remember someone saying to me that UK was great for generating talent, but that it was a nightmare to market bands in the UK because it's a relatively small market, so you end up spending a lot of money with very little return. Whereas obviously the economics of being a success in the States are far more, it works much, much better, But I think over the years the UK's thrown up some of the most interesting bands, and the Beatles being obviously, for me, still the centre of the universe when it comes to the kind of music that I spent my life doing.
Yeah, I didn't even realize that my personal favorite Wang Chung song, Dance Hall Days, was launched in the UK, but only really found success in the States, and that kind of helped expose you guys to the rest of the world, essentially. Very much so, yeah. I mean, we had a fair shot in the UK with Dance Hall Days. We did Top of the Pops twice. Top of the Pops was this sort of 1 half-hour show a week that was on the BBC that showcased current pop music, basically, in a very eclectic way, because it was the one show and the BBC kind of had a monopoly, really, still, well, not anymore, actually, but they had a monopoly then. So you would see all kinds of different acts, from crooners, Engelbert Humperdinck, to boy bands, to Wang Chung. I remember when I was a kid watching Top of the Pops and seeing David Bowie for the first time, which was a real, shock. Well, not shock in a bad way, but it was liberating, just seeing the way he dressed and presented himself as Ziggy Stardust and stuff, And so Top of the Pops was quite sort of, quite a cutting-edge show in its way, although being BBC, it was also very conservative. But we did Top of the Pops twice, so that sort of gave us the exposure. But I guess Wang Chung in the UK, people just couldn't work out, this Chinese band, what the hell is this, do you know what I mean, and didn't gravitate to it. Whereas in the States, people were more curious, I think, and kind of, and also there was MTV, and that gave a sort of face to the name, and I think MTV was a huge factor in our success. Yeah, Top of the Pops is it's still on, isn't it? It's been going for decades, hasn't it?
It's actually finished. They cancelled it probably at least 10 years ago, I think. Yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah, in a strange way, the British establishment, if you like, which the BBC certainly represents, are still very sceptical about pop music and what it is. I think they sort of probably, for good reason, distrust it, and so they're not keen on all that stuff. And these days, what goes as pop music is very bland and just in the realm of entertainment. Whereas I think still in the 80s when we were doing it, there was a sort of slightly subversive element to it, and that's what kind of made it exciting. And certainly in the few years before us, when you had the Sex Pistols on TV and stuff, they were pretty overtly antisocial, for want of a better word, And, that was all kind of, it was a good, what's the word, sort of escape valve. Do you know what I mean? I think, likewise, seeing Bowie and his presentation of himself in this kind of bisexual kind of way, do you know what I mean? It was a powerful symbol of a kind of freedom that everybody had, which feels very different these days, where everything's kind of put into little boxes, and it's if you're this sort of person, then you like that sort of thing, and everything's kind of divided up. Back in those days, it was much more sort of generalised across the board somehow, So, different times, but all very interesting.
It's interesting to hear you say the BBC, at least musically, was so conservative because growing up watching shows like Monty Python and the Young Ones, you wouldn't have gotten that view, at least from watching the TV shows, that they were that conservative. Because,
sure.
I mean, kind of counterculture, Monty Python and Young Ones were still sort of like sticking it to the man.
That's true, yeah. I mean, I think on that sort of comedy thing, that was a very powerful thing, and I think very much part of the culture. Certainly, when I was a kid growing up, Monty Python and progressive rock were kind of intimately part of the same pattern, if you know what I mean. But I guess even Monty Python, they all went to Oxford and Cambridge. Those guys, do you know what I mean? They're not like coming up from the streets.
True, yeah.
Whereas pop music was doing that, I mean, I think that's an interesting thing about. We're talking about social engineering now, in a sense, but most bands and most movie stars now come from privileged backgrounds of one sort or another. In the UK, that is, because you've got to have money to be able to do those things now. Whereas when I was doing it, you did it because you didn't have any. it was a completely DIY thing, and I think that gave the arts in the UK an incredible forward impetus. The 60s and 70s. 80s as well, I think UK led fashion, and it all came from people from the street, for want of a better word for it, like people grew up in towns like I did, where there was no culture and no sort of prospect of doing anything really, and pop music or fashion, and those two things were always very intimately linked in the UK. They were all part of the same train that you tried to jump on if you possibly could.
We would go
now. Keep going up.
No, continue.
I made my point, so yeah, I'll stop.
Oh no, you're good. You can say as much as you want. I got all day, my friend.
Okay, yeah. Well, there's a great book actually, which I'd recommend, by a guy called John Higgs, and it's called. What's it called? It's basically a book about the Beatles and James Bond, and it takes the sort of. The starting point, as I think it's like the 9th of October 1962 or something like that, was the day that Love Me Do, the first Beatles single, and Dr. No, the first James Bond movie, were launched in the UK. And he goes on to sort of say that these two things became the most successful franchises in the world, how they came out of very different versions of the UK. The Beatles being from Liverpool, from a very working class thing, and James Bond being from a much more middle class perspective. With Ian Fleming being a sort of civil servant and a kind of Cambridge graduate, and how these two versions of the UK sort of competed in the world through the 60s and 70s. But that they came from very different places, and I think that's very, very interesting. The book is a play on it.
It's called Love and Let Die. I just looked it up.
To Love and Let Die. That's exactly right. Yeah, To Love and Let Die. So his whole point was, that the Beatles' message was really encapsulated in the song "Can't Buy Me Love." It's in other words, you can buy material things, but you can't buy that essential human quality. Whereas James Bond is predicated on everything has a price. You can buy everything, and James Bond has the best of everything. The best martinis, and the best cars, and the best women, and the best. Do you know what I mean? It's like, so it's a completely different worldview from the Beatles' worldview of you don't need money to be happy.
Right.
You need love. So those two things I think are very interesting, and the way those two things have played out across to where we are now, where I think probably sadly the James Bond view has sort of won out to a certain extent.
Definitely in many places the material side of things has won out for sure.
Yeah.
I'm going to add that book to my reading list. But let's go back a little bit to the MTV days, because I think everybody who was around remembers the video for Everybody Have Fun Tonight, which was one of the most visually interesting videos of the 80s, which was an extremely experimental age. Did they just film you guys doing the song multiple times and then splice little half seconds of each one over and over, back and forth?
Exactly. That's exactly what they did. Yeah. And some poor guy, because in those days it was before computers and the sort of editing on screen, as it were. He was physically chopping up the tape,
Oh, wow.
which must have been. I'm sure he retired from the video editing business after that. But yeah, that's how it was done. The instruction to me was basically to sing the song straight into the camera and try not to move, which was great, especially after having made videos like. I think it's the one for Fire in the Twilight, where I was literally running through the streets on Ventura Boulevard anyway for the whole day. I think shooting that that video. Rather. It was a very focused shoot. The Everybody Have Fun Tonight thing, and I enjoyed it a lot, and I still think that's a great video.
I gotta say, even though, and you just said you enjoyed it a lot, and it's called Everybody Have Fun Tonight, you have a very serious look throughout the whole video. It doesn't look like you were having too much fun.
Well, that was again part of the kind of only an English director would tell you to not smile and just look intense.
And that was Godley and Cream that did that video, right?
It was, yeah, very interesting guys. It's just fascinating chatting with them about their other projects that were going on at the time, and it was great working with them.
Now, you guys obviously huge in the mid '80s all around the world. When the grunge hit in the 90s, a lot of 80s music sort of took a huge back seat and disappeared for a while. But late 90s, mid 2000s, it started to see a resurgence, and everybody was like, oh, yeah, these 80s songs were awesome. Why did we stop listening to them? Have you seen that same sort of resurgence and energy for your songs still touring today?
Very much so, yeah. I think it's an interesting thing when you have these styles of music. So obviously, I experienced it very personally in through the 80s with Wang Chung. And when we were recording our last album, The Warmer Side of Cool, which was a difficult album to make because we were sort of, I think Everybody Have Fun Tonight, the pendulum swung us very much into that sort of pop party sort of realm, The previous project we'd done, To Live and Die in LA, was a much more kind of artsy project, And I think Wang Chung sort of moved between these two areas more or less successfully for a while, although I think Kevin probably found it very hard to figure out how to, market us, what exactly are you guys, I mean, we never quite settled on what we were, And The Warmer Side of Cool, I think we were struggling to define ourselves really, with that album. But I was aware that Geffen had signed Guns N' Roses and that Nirvana was sort of around the corner. And, there was definitely a sense that the times they were changing, and that Wang Chung was really sort of pretty out of step with what was happening. We certainly weren't a grunge band, and we weren't a hip-hop band either, which was the other alternative, to go down the more sort of using samplers and that kind of thing. We were sort of, in a sense, going back to our progressive rock roots on the warmer side of cool, and that definitely was not a fashionable thing to be doing, let alone being an 80s band anyway, So, yeah, but I respect that drift. The same thing that happened in the UK in 78 or 76, really, with the Sex Pistols and the whole punk thing, which kicked out all of the prog rock bands, bands like Genesis and Pink Floyd and Yes, who were really mainstream alternative bands at that time, suddenly became deeply unfashionable, and punk was all about, 3 chords and the truth, and, there weren't any tunes in 5/8 anymore. So, and I think grunge was a similar thing. And I said to somebody recently, grunge definitely, if the 80s was this kind of optimistic, idealistic world, and it kind of was in a way, but as it was being presented in rock music, pop music, and in the movies as well. The 90s and grunge kind of broke the spell, in a sense.
Yes, definitely.
It was powerful for a lot of people. But where do you go with that, really? I mean, when you sort of say it's all bullshit, that life's crap and you've just got to deal with it. It's like, it's worth having that realization, but then kind of thinking, but I prefer to think, more positively, you've got to pick yourself up out of that, and I think 80s music sort of does that for people. You go back to those 80s songs and it's kind of like, yeah, maybe it is okay.
Thank you so much, Jack, for taking the time today. Can't wait for Abducted by the 80s to come to town, and hopefully I will see you at the show. It's been an honor talking to you, my friend.
I've enjoyed it. Thanks, Ethan, and definitely make yourself known to me.